Have a seat on your porcelain throne. It's time to talk some shit on the Powell movement.
Welcome to the Powell movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and this week I'm back from the Winter Sports Market Trade Show, and let me tell you, I miss big industry trade shows. They're one of the best ways to build community in the industry. Sure, trade shows are expensive for brands and community can be built in so many different ways, but trade shows bring so many like-minded people together under one roof. While this was a buying group show and not a media show, I love getting a sneak peek at all the new products. And while I'm partial to what Elon's producing, everybody is making cool shit. But nerding out on product isn't the only reason I went. I was there to see old friends, meet new ones, and get marketing contacts so I can sell my last podcast ad slot in. I did all of those things, and while being on snow is what this is all about and where the best times are really had, the trade show was a refreshing reminder of what the industry used to be. Outside of the show, my favorite part was the incredible dinner I had at the Capitol Grill downtown with the High Fives Foundation's Roy Tuscany, Jesse Murphy, and good friend Digi Dave Amaral. This is hands down the best steakhouse in Salt Lake City, and it was one of the best meals I've had in years. Everything was perfect. The food, the company, but the best part about the dinner was the owner, Bill Bowler. This dude is a skier who's so stoked on the sport. And he had just seen the Do Not Miss Level 1 movie on Netflix right now, Full Circle. If you haven't seen it, it tells the story of Trevor Kennison, who's been a guest on the podcast, and Barry Corbett, who's a legend within the sport that everybody needs to learn about. And in the movie, Roy had a lot of screen time. So when Bill saw Roy, he gravitated towards our table. And we chatted it up all night about skiing, his incredible made-from-scratch desserts, and so much more. It was such an incredible restaurant experience that you're hearing a whole lot about it in my podcast intro. That's how great it was. So thank you, Bill, for your time and attention. If you're a skier in the Salt Lake City area, go there and make sure you let Bill know you love to ski, and you will feel the love. I'm sure snowboarders are just as welcome. Other than that, it's been so warm in Washington, tons of rain, which means Avi danger is high and POW days are low. Regardless, I'll be on the mic for the Alpental Freeride Open, which happens on the 15th. It's always a great way to see the up-and-coming local talent kill it at my favorite local mountain. Hopefully we're not wearing trash bags. Actually, I never do that because I rock outdoor research gear and I never get wet. Speaking of outdoor research, it was a roller coaster of a week for their athletes. Troy Podmelsack took X Games gold, Zoe Atkin took X Games silver, and while those are the highlights, there were lowlights as well. In Japan, athlete Micah Evangelista, who's been on the podcast, had a really bad fracture where his femur meets his pelvis. He didn't have travel insurance, and these are scary times for an awesome dude. He has a GoFundMe set up that I encourage you to donate to. I know every penny will help Micah. International travel can be scary, and I'm sorry that you're going through this, Micah. Speaking of international travel, I have a lot of it coming up. And first off, it's Vancouver and Whistler. I'll get a couple of days sightseeing with Ange, a couple of days skiing with Keaton, and I hope to run into a bunch of friends that I haven't seen in a long time. One person I'll definitely have a beer with is my guest this week, Nick McNutt. He's a dude who spent almost a decade in Whistler as a ski bum, and he was known for his huge switch landings in deep snow, but he was an underground talent that people talked about, but we never really saw him in the ski industry. But when you shred as hard as Nick does, you can only be underground for so long. And for the past decade, Nick has been one of the stars of TGR's annual movies. On top of that, he's one of the nicest and humble people I've had on the podcast. It's a cool story. Before we get into it, I want to thank you for listening. I want to ask you to tell a friend about the show this week. And most importantly, please check out my sponsors. I only work with the best, and they are Outdoor Research, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, Best Day Brewing, Stanley, and Elon Skis. Now, it's time to talk with Nick McNutt. When you have Nut in your last name, I'm sure there can be plenty of funny jokes and nicknames, and what are some of the better ones that you've heard?
Yeah, I mean, high school is definitely like a pretty tough place for that. It's gotten a little better with age and, maturity, surrounding myself with people who aren't like 15 years old. But yeah, there's been some good ones. I actually went to high school with this guy, Reed Speedman. He's an industry standard.
Yeah.
Person you might know. I remember he had one. It was like Nicholas is my first name, but he was calling me Dickless McNonuts.
Okay.
That was probably like the number one worst name that I ever had in high school that I can think of, or like most creative, because a lot of them are just sort of like, yeah, Dick McNutt or Dick McButt or whatever,
Yeah, or get some McNutt all over your face, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's right there. So people take it. It's easy pickings.
Low-hanging fruit, for sure.
Exactly.
And then when you think about later on in your career, one of your great friends who ended up being one of your filmers, Scotty, I think his last name is like Tittingham or something like that. Whenever you went places, it was like tits and nuts. Did people pick up on that?
Yeah, Scott Titterington. I never really heard our two names like be combined in that way. I'm sure he probably had a tough time in high school too with his last name. But yeah, Titterington and McNutt, the dynamic duo, is definitely a bit of an interesting one for the mouth.
So tits were more of a mouthful than nuts in that case, and that's fair enough. And speaking of nuts, you were born in Quebec, but I don't think you're a French-speaking Canadian. You're there because your folks are ski bums and they were based out of Mont Tremblant. Is that where you learned how to ski?
Yeah, that's right. My parents are both from Ontario, and they both moved to Quebec to be near the bigger mountains, like Tremblant being the big mountain around there. But I learned to ski at a little hill called Grey Rocks Resort, which is now closed down, pretty close to Mont Tremblant, and then also at Tremblant. So between those two hills. And my parents were both working like for the resort, so we had passes to both. My memories from that time are pretty vague. Like I moved to BC when I was just after kindergarten, so I was super, super young. I never spoke French. I went to kindergarten. It was like a French-speaking kindergarten. I don't think I did super well there. But yeah, as far as like my memories go, I definitely grew up, more in BC. But my first times on skis were for sure out east. It's pretty cool, and I have a lot of respect for those East Coast skiers, man. It seems like you got to love it a lot to be willing to go through the lengths they go to just get out there as much as they do.
For sure. And when you moved west, you moved from like a French-Canadian area to a German area because Kimberley, BC at that point was like a Bavarian village. And was it like a huge tourist attraction, and did all the townsfolk get into it?
I mean, huge tourist attraction. I don't know if you could really say that. It's like, yeah, they had, an accordion festival that would happen every year. There was definitely like German architecture in like the municipal buildings. And they had this area called the Platzel, which is like the pedestrian village. A bunch of German restaurants and stuff. But I think like that whole thing was sort of fizzling out when I moved there, and it was sort of on the trajectory of becoming a little bit more of like a outdoor recreation town. There's a lot of younger families that moved there because it's relatively inexpensive. There's lots of good weather, good access to biking and skiing, that kind of thing. So they don't really seem to do that anymore.
Ski-wise, I was going to assume that you grew up skiing or you learned how to ski at Kimberley Alpine Resort after you moved from the East Coast. But really, you start skiing at Fairmont Hot Springs. What's that place like? Is it just like a tiny mom and pop?
Yeah, so actually, I lived in Fairmont Hot Springs for like 5 years before I moved to Kimberley. So it's pretty much just south of Invermere, which is where Panorama Mountain Resort is.
Okay.
We go skiing up there sometimes, or we would drive south to Kimberley sometimes. But yeah, it's a really, really small hill in Fairmont. It's like, I want to say 12 runs and probably 500 vertical feet or something. Like it's tiny. And it's these kind of like timeshare mecca with lots of golf, and there's hot springs there, obviously. So that's kind of the draw. And then the ski hill's like a little bonus. It's definitely not like a main attraction.
Like a true four-season resort.
Yeah, exactly. And I grew up ski racing. So I ski raced until I was pretty much forced to get into like a speed suit. So I want to say I was around 12 or so, like J4 and that J3 level. When you sort of needed to take it more serious, I was pretty burnt out on it by then. I was ready to just go free ride.
Was it something where your parents pushed you into ski racing to kind of maybe have like a program to be in, or did you want to ski race?
No, I think I liked it. Like at first it was fun just being able to go ski all these cool different mountains. Like part of the whole ski racing thing was you would get to go kind of travel locally. We would go to some of the different resorts within, a couple hours, 3-hour drive. And I liked that part of it, but I always felt a little bit like shortchanged because we would go to these places and I would sort of just be like waiting around to go on the course, and not really getting to explore the terrain. And yeah, I wasn't too old when I realized the structured way of skiing wasn't really for me.
And ski racing is expensive, and I always like to find out if people are rich, poor, or average growing up. Your dad's a carpenter. Where does that put you? Like right in the middle?
Yeah, I'd say we were just sort of middle class. Like we had always skiing was like the main thing our family did, and they kind of made sacrifices to allow that to happen. And they structured their lives around it too. Like it was definitely our main family activity. In the summers, like we would be in, the classic sort of kids soccer and stuff like that, but nothing really lavish. It was always very ski focused for our whole family.
Carpentry is hard manual labor, and it's one of those things that'll build up a strong work ethic at a young age. And work ethic will carry over to everything that you do in your life. Does your dad kind of teach you the trade when you're a young kid?
Yeah, so he had a couple friends that he was doing this like house flipping sort of stuff, and it ended up being probably around the age of like 10 or 12 or something, that around that same age where I was helping, I'd be just painting or cutting for him or doing whatever. And I started to pick it up. And I guess I kind of had a little bit of a mind for it because it sort of became a more attractive option to make money versus like being maybe in restaurant work or something like that. And so I ended up just kind of following in those footsteps.
The next footsteps that you follow in terms of snow is you move to snowboarding, it sounds like, after you're done with your ski racing. And Kimberly was known because it had a good terrain park. While these days life's all about powder days, back then was it all about lapping the park like day and night?
Yeah, I mean, Kimberly is really, really sunny and they don't generally get that much snow. But for sure at that point, when I quit racing, like the ski options are in general were just really boring, right? Like think about parabolic skis were sort of new, but there was not really a twin tip ski revolution quite yet. This is, I want to say, in the
Like 97-ish?
yeah, mid to late 90s. And snowboarding was this new thing. And it was actually like the snowboard park, not the terrain park. And it was
Right.
kind of just this way to be a little bit more, I had like a youthful energy and I really liked it. I thought it was fun. But as soon as there was like this twin tip revolution starting, I was right up back on the skis right away.
Okay, so it's like the 1080 comes out, you see those, and it's like you want to get into them. And I read in some powder story that you and your dad built your first twin tips. What's the story behind that?
Yeah, they were like pretty hard to find. They were kind of elusive for that first like one or two seasons that they were being produced by just a couple companies, right? Like the 1080 and the Line 1260.
Poacher?
Yeah, the Rossi Pow Air. I remember like a handful of skis that had some level of a twin tip, but you didn't see them very often, at least for that first little while. And so we had some just parabolic kind of just groomer skis that we just melted the tails with the heat gun and just like vice grip, folded them up. And they were just kinked enough that I could get around backwards on firm snow. Yeah, that was the start for me.
When you put time and effort into building a ski that's going to go backwards, and not many people have them, especially where you are, do you focus on spending like all the time you possibly have, like skiing switch and hitting everything switch?
Yeah, it was definitely like a novelty and it was kind of fun, like just this new thing that so many people now are doing it that it's not really that weird to see. But back then, like people skiing backwards was pretty funky, and I just thought it was different and cool. And, we have this run in Kimberley called the main, and it's just the main run under the main chair. And there's sort of a steep bit after the park's over. There's like the steepest pitch of it, and it's a blue square. But just bombing down there backwards was always kind of like my fun way out of the park. And for sure, like those sort of early teen years, I spent a lot of time doing that.
Just old people wondering what the hell is going on. He's going backwards. That's crazy.
Yeah, exactly. Kimberly's at that point, especially, it was a bit of like a retirement type community. So there was definitely a lot of traditional older type skiers that were like, what is going on? It was just watching the terrain park, evolve from a snowboard park to seeing skiers in there. Even that was kind of weird.
Well, they were probably like, at least he's not a snowboarder.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think this is all around the time that Session 1242 came out. Did that movie, and more specifically Pep segment in particular, have a big influence on you?
Yeah, watching, I want to say 1242, there was a handful of films like in that sort of era that definitely were like kind of big deals for me. But the one that really, really did it, I feel like, was watching Idea, like the Nimbus film was probably the one.
That was a little later though, right?
It was a little later, yeah. 1242 would have been a couple years before that. I'm trying to think of the timeline around it, but there was a couple films like 1242, I feel like Happy Days. There was some Poor Boys films, Ready, Fire, Aim, I want to say,
Yep.
around that same time, where like guys like Dash, Pep, there was a bunch of guys who were kind of like dabbling with a little bit more switch skiing. And that was definitely something that I thought was like super progressive and cool and had just a lot of potential to become like something bigger. Like it just doubles your options, instantly just by being able to go backwards. So, and snowboarders are riding switch anyways. And, the skis kind of were going that direction. So it seemed like there was room to grow.
And this is all happening while you're in high school. And thinking back to that time while we're talking about skiing, were there any other sports, or did you play instruments or have any extracurricular activities going on? Like what other shit were you into other than being on snow?
I was really, really big into biking, and Kimberly's winter was quite short. It's the season's over. It's like Christmas to Easter, kind of a ski season there.
Yep.
So the rest of the year, the other 7, 8 months of the year, I was biking. I grew up doing kind of like this glorified BMX, kind of like slope style third jumper kind of biking.
Okay.
So that was like all through high school. I did that a lot. And that actually kind of was what brought me to Whistler originally. I actually came out, like Crankworks was here, and I came out just to see that event. And, you know, it was kind of just mind blowing. I knew the place was incredible to ski, but just the Four Seasons sort of draw was like pretty hard to ignore at that point. So between biking and then, yeah, that was pretty much it. You know, I played hockey as a Canadian. It's sort of like a standard thing to do. I played hockey for a season, but it took away from skiing too much to really want to bother with like the structure again. It just seemed like I didn't ski at all that year. It's fun, but it wasn't more fun than skiing. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I was just biking, and, you know, musically, like I like to play guitar. I started playing guitar in high school, but other than that, like it was pretty much like skiing and biking were like my full-time focuses, depending on the season.
When you think about playing hockey, while you're a pretty big dude these days, I heard in high school you were like teeny. Was that true? Like you were just the small kid in high school and had your growth spurt afterwards?
Yeah, I was a late bloomer. Like for sure, when I moved out, I was pretty small for my age. I moved to Whistler when I was 17, and I really like probably grew a lot in that 17th year of life. So I was pretty small in high school.
So you're a small kid in high school, and when you're a senior in high school, were there any aspirations to go to college, or do you know that you're going straight to Whistler once you're done?
Yeah, you know, I'd like kind of thought about maybe doing like a trade program just to be able to like have a sort of professional career that would also work like with my desire to go ski. Like I knew I wanted to ski and just make myself available for that as much as I could and do whatever it took to shape my life that way. But I never really had the whole like proper go to university kind of motivation. It just seemed like it would take all of my time away from skiing. And I didn't really have anything like obvious to me that I wanted to invest that much time and energy into learning. At that point, it was just like all I could think about was skiing, to be honest, and just doing whatever work that I could find, pick up to make it happen just seemed like kind of where I was being pulled.
And were your parents cool with you moving out at 17 and going to Whistler? Like, I'm sure, you know, from what I've heard, you're not a big partier and you're pretty mature and responsible. So they probably know they have a good kid. But sending you out to Whistler so young, did they have any reservations with that?
Yeah, you know, I think that they probably thought I was leaving a little bit early. I think it was probably harder for them than they would admit to. But for sure, I was, you know, a kid, and seeing their firstborn kid leave the house at that age is probably tough for any parent. But I was not really moving there, like you said, to go party or to just like go be rebellious, or like I just wanted a bigger mountain to ski, and I just wanted to be able to be closer to where the action was happening. And you know, it was just so obvious that that was sort of where the ski industry revolved around in North America, or at least in Canada. So I had a pretty hard time thinking of any other thing to do, to be honest.
And when you say the industry revolved around Whistler, it wasn't like you were moving there to hopefully start a pro career, was it? Because I don't think that was really in the cards. Like you were just going there to shred, right?
Yeah, exactly. It was just exciting to be around. You know, Kimberly is like, especially at that point, it was like a pretty sleepy place, a small community. And I knew every single freestyle skier or free rider, like by first name basis. There's 20 people or less, you know, in the whole town that do it. And even in the whole sort of region, you kind of know everyone who's in the mix. And here it's just like everyone is a good skier, and just everyone's so passionate, and the season's 2 or 3 times as long, and there's just always events happening. And it was just sort of a place that if you're a skier and that's what you care about and that's what you want to surround yourself with, it was just the obvious place to go.
And when you go there, do you have housing lined up? Do you know people, or are you pretty much going there blind?
No, I went like completely solo, and we did some research, my dad and I, and we figured out like, you know, Whistler Blackcomb offered us staff housing. And at that point, I think it was maybe a little easier to get into than now, as every sort of housing situation has gotten a bit tougher. But I ended up moving out in September, like way ahead of the season, just to make sure I kind of locked something in as the mountain bike season was winding down. So yeah, I moved into the staff housing in Whistler at 17 years old in September. And I just sort of like kind of cruised for a few months biking until my job started up, and didn't start until pretty much Christmas time.
So you work for Whistler for at least that first year. When do you eventually transition into just using your carpentry skills and be able to just work all summer and be able to ski all winter?
Well, I got a carpentry job right away when I moved to Whistler. Actually, like my Whistler Blackcomb job didn't start until the winter time, but I did like kind of pick up a little bit of laboring work. My uncle was living out in Pemberton and introduced me to, you know, a contractor. And I just sort of started at the bottom of the totem pole and ended up kind of progressing through the company over a period of time. And I would just basically ask for days off as much as possible, or mornings off. And anytime it snowed a decent amount, I'd be trying to ski So the first few seasons, I had to work for my housing and my ski pass. I had to work for Whistler Blackcomb for that first few months. But then once I moved out into like a regular place and was just trying to work a normal sort of carpentry job, I was basically working full time in the summer and fall, and I would be taking off sort of as much as possible in the winter. But it was the first like 5 or 6 years where I still did have to work like 20 to 30 hours a week at least, which was tough.
Yeah, I can imagine. If you go there just to ski all the time and you have to work.
Yeah.
But I would think with the Olympics coming to Whistler in 2010, there must have been a ton of carpentry work. Like, do you have to leave town to make money, or you could stay all summer and be able to work in Whistler?
Yeah, it was all here, man. Like the Olympics happening, it was just people could not find enough help. So there was no shortage of work. And that's why I was able to take as much time off as I was getting, because they had no choice really. Like the alternative was to just fire me for kind of always going away and just being like kind of unreliable. Like when I was at work, I would work well enough and everything, but I wanted to go ski. So if it snowed, I was going to try and like play hooky basically. And they didn't have any other option because when I was there, I was useful. So they just put up with it, I guess.
Now it's time for my first sponsor break, and I want you to buy all of your ski and snowboard gear from Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. Why Peter Glenn? Well, first and foremost, they're the little guy who's been getting people out on snow for over 65 years. They aren't trying to take over an industry by making a ton of branded products that compete with the brands they already sell. They're not trying to get you to stay at a hotel or sell you a vacation. Peter Glenn is about making sure you purchase the right products to ensure that you're going to have the most fun on the hill. And they have all the brands, all the products, and incredible deals both in-store and online. While other retailers focus on algorithms and AI, Peter Glenn is all about having the most knowledgeable staff that understands what you need. And if you've been following them on Instagram, they've been dropping some incredible pro tips that will make your time on the hill more enjoyable. At the end of the day, people have trusted Peter Glenn since 1958 because of their proven track record and all-around passion for snow and beyond. So if you ski, snowboard, inline skate, wakeboard, water ski, or need outerwear for your adventure, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports is your one-stop shop, and they offer free shipping on orders over $50, a hassle-free return policy, and they price-match reputable dealers. So please support this podcast and buy your stuff over at peterglenn.com. Next up, it's Elan Skis. I started telling you about Elan building a cult following in the States about 3 years ago. And if you're like me and heading up to the mountain on a weekly basis, I know you've been seeing more Elans. There's a reason for that. People who ski Elans notice that skiing on award-winning products made in what is considered the best factory in the world will make them a better skier. The product they put into the marketplace is second to none. I mean, Elan's a company that also makes luxury yachts, and they don't cut corners on materials or production. The difference in quality is noticeable. Walk up to any ski wall and compare the craftsmanship of an Elan ski to everything else on the wall. You'll see a difference in the fit and finish, but the most important difference is how they'll perform on snow. That's why Elan's been winning a ton of awards at the magazine tests, because they really do ski better. If you want to have more fun on the mountain this season, get on an Elan. You can find out about all things Elan over at elanskis.com. My final sponsor this round is Stanley, and if you haven't been hearing a lot about Stanley lately, you must be living under a rock. They've absolutely blown up in 2023, and everyone is talking about them. I've been telling you about how incredible their products are at keeping your drinks hotter and colder than anyone else's for about 7 years now. I mean, they invented the category in 1913, and while they always have done well, the world now knows that if you don't have a Stanley, you don't have the best. And I love having the best. Personally, I use Stanley pint glasses every single day, and I swear by them. And my wife and so many others can't live without their Stanley quenchers. And recently, I've integrated Stanley food storage devices into my ski routine. Instead of buying $20 burgers, we bring our food to the mountain and it stays piping hot in our Stanleys. And I end up saving about $70 a weekend not buying food. While that's rad, what's even radder is that Stanley offers Powell Movement listeners their biggest discount that they make available to the public. I'm going to save you 30% on all your Stanley products. Here's what you need to do to get that discount. Head on over to stanley1913.com, go shopping, and at checkout, enter the code SNOW30. That's all caps and the number 30 with no spaces, and you'll save that 30%. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. We talked about you being teeny in high school and then you growing. I mean, I heard you grew almost like a foot when you got to Whistler and put on a ton of muscle. Does the increased size and mass help or hurt your skiing at first?
It's hard to say because I feel like that whole age, in your teenage years, like you're still just growing in weird ways and you're like getting stronger. and your body is still just like kind of invincible at that point. So I feel like that whole time it was just sort of getting stronger all the time didn't hurt me. I don't think being a taller skier necessarily helps very much. Like for sure, I think like you might feel more impact being a bigger person and just having more height to compress, when you hit cliffs and stuff. So overall, it's probably not like the best thing in the world for free riding, but I just make do with what I have.
And when you're tall, I mean, it's just harder to make everything look good, but you're able to do that. And I think you were skiing with a bunch of shorter guys, because when I think about Whistler at that time in that era, and I'm not 100% about this, but there was a switch movement going on and some people were into it and really focused on it, which you were one of those people. And some of the best dudes were living under the radar in Whistler. There was Charlie Yeager, there was Josh Stack. Those are the two that come to mind. Did you connect with those dudes early on?
Yeah, I did. And Chris Turpin is another one.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was definitely a bit of a scene here for that. And like the original sort of K2 Hellbents, like I remember, well, Charlie would have been on the team at that point. I think Josh might have been like kind of on the team, or he did something to get some Hellbents. And basically they were the ski that everyone wanted at that point, right? That was like the best ski for going switch and powder that anyone made at that point. And for sure, I ended up connecting with those guys and I ended up skiing with them actually a fair bit. And one of those first couple of years that I had a snowmobile, I was actually going out filming with them a fair bit as well. A lot of that footage never made it too many places, but we had some good times just free riding. And, I still see Charlie once in a while. I actually skied with him last winter a couple times.
Nice. Yeah, I actually did a podcast with him, which was pretty awesome because I didn't think I'd ever hear from him again. And during the podcast, he was telling me some stories about some of the ski bummy shit that he did to get by, like poaching the gondola, movie theaters, hot tubs, all kinds of shit. Did you have any ski bum tricks that you used to get by, or were you more above the line?
I like always had a pass. I felt like those guys ended up getting away without a pass a lot somehow. And I don't know how they did it, but I think they were just going out sledding as much as they possibly could. But I actually really like riding the hill, especially early season when you can ride onto the chairlift a little more often. You're not waiting in line. And I think it's just like good to build your ski muscles up, even if it's like track down, whatever. So I always just like had an honest pass and, we poached some hot tubs and stuff, but nothing crazy.
Okay. And then 2007 is that Nimbus year. That's, I think, when Idea comes out. That movie has a huge impact on you and that whole crew out there. And given that you guys are already pretty established skiers, you're not on the pro level yet, you personally, but is it still something where you kind of like T-Dog out and watch that movie over and over?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was like a religious watcher of ski movies, especially when I was younger. I would wear out VHSs back in the day, and then DVDs came around. And yeah, I had a handful. I mean, I still have them in a box somewhere at my place. But yeah, that one got a lot of play, because I feel like up until that point, ski films, like up until, think about like Teddy Bear Crisis and some of these movies that were all about just like kind of pushing the limits of how big skiers can go.
Yeah.
It suddenly became this big shift of like, well, imagine how much fun skiers can have. And that was sort of their whole thing, right? It was like taking these kind of like flowy little snowboard kind of jib moves and like hitting small stuff. They were mixing in like big jumps and stuff. They're still hitting pretty big gaps and going backwards, which is super impressive. But just their screwing around sort of in the mellow terrain was like so entertaining to watch and so relatable. And it was like this cool part of skiing that I felt like had tons of room to grow. So we watched that a lot, and it definitely had a big influence on me.
And when you think about it, like the ski tech at that point pretty much allowed your ski style to develop, like between landing backwards and all the different butter variations that you have in your game. Would any of that happen without a shit ton of rocker and skis that everybody was putting in at that point?
I don't think so. I mean, to be honest, like what really helped, I think, evolve my sort of style on skis is my first ever pair of really rockered powder skis was the Line EP Pro, like the very, very first ones. They had this map of the West Coast going down them, but they were like just outrageously soft. Like I don't think you could produce that ski and sell it in the modern times.
Right.
It was just like laughably soft. There'd be times where I would land a drop in deep snow and the tip would fold and hit me in the knee and not release. Like they would just fully almost fold into a circle. And then on top of that, I was riding a 185, which for me is a bit short, and I didn't have poles. And it snowed a lot that year, so we were skiing deep pow a ton. And I would go into the park at the end of the day, and hit like the big park jumps backwards and whatever. Like doing all that stuff with no poles on those super floppy skis, I think gave me like a little bit of an appreciation for like a fine balance point. And now on the skis, it feels like cheating compared to what we were on back then because they're so good.
Was the no poles thing a direct influence of Pep and Andy back then, and Pollard as well?
Oh, yeah. Their whole thing was like, what do you need those for? You know, like they're useful to get around the lift line, but like, do you really need them for skiing? Not really, you know, like suddenly you had all these options of doing different hand drags and stuff like that. And I thought that was pretty cool. The novelty wore off on it, and it does get annoying not having them. And I haven't skied without them in a long time, but it was super fun and kind of freeing, and just, it was different, right? It was kind of shaking up what people thought of the norm as skiing. And it was just kind of cool to kind of be part of that.
And the no poles thing, given it's not really a thing anymore, but it seemed like in contests like last year and the year before, there were a lot of kids skiing without poles. And I think Fisk came in and said, now you have to ski with poles. Did you hear about that? And what were your thoughts on it?
I did hear about that. I mean, I can see sort of both sides of that argument. I think it's a little bit different, right? Because the way that we were like skiing without poles was like skiing in powder on these giant skis without poles, for the sake of basically being able to like use your hands to like grab trees as you go by and use them to spin around. And it was almost like having another appendage you don't normally use.
Okay.
But I think like when you're doing a triple 18 or whatever, like the poles suddenly become like truly in the way, and it's probably easier to do it without it, because it is getting to be a little bit like aerials.
Totally.
Mind you, like the style is like pretty insane on what these guys are doing with some of these triples with the mega spins. But yeah, I mean, the poles thing, I don't know. Again, I'm not like one for structured skiing. Like I think the whole Fisk contest things, it's not really for me.
Well, if it's not really for you, the Olympics come to town in 2010. And being a local, what was the highlight and lowlight of the Olympic experience for you?
What low light, man. It was awesome. I think the season started slow, but when the Olympics were happening, it was just a ghost town on the hill. Like it was nuking every day. I just remember that being some of the deepest skiing I've had with just nobody home. Like everyone I think had Airbnb'd their places out or whatever, and they were on vacation, like paid in Hawaii. They were out of here.
Yeah.
And for the people who were here to ski, like it was awesome. I just remember skiing a lot of awesome POW, and like going over the gondola, like going over the downhill run, and you know, all the people who are volunteering are like shoveling the course off every day and stuff, and you're just kind of laughing at them. Like it was great.
That season was a big one for you, not just because of the Olympics. I think the other reason is, how do you end up filming with PYP for amateur hour and part-time? Because I'm guessing they must have come to you, because it doesn't seem like you're one of those guys that advocates for yourself at all. It's kind of like people come to you and help you out, and you've been able to develop a career from that, but you're not like, hey, look at me, look at me, look at me.
Well, that season, I think, would have been the season that I met Scott Titterington, who's cinematographer. And then a bunch of my close friends were involved with that project. So there was like Liam Casey, Mike Ness, Jordan Clark. It was sort of this greater Vancouver area, sort of younger up and coming skiers, right? Mac Jones, Rob Hewley. There's a bunch of people like living in this area that were in their sort of AMs, or like people trying to make breakthroughs. And they didn't really have very much powder skiing in the film. I remember it was like pretty urban heavy, a bunch of park. And it was pretty high production quality, you know, and a few of these cinematographers have gone, like Graham Meiklejohn's gone on to be, you know, he's still in the industry doing film projects and stuff. So there's people have made it through that whole thing. But I think, yeah, they just wanted another powder skier. And I ended up just sort of befriending those guys. I can't remember exactly how it went, but we bought snowmobiles that year. Like that was the year I bought a snowmobile, must have been. First year I went out filming with Scotty. And I can't exactly remember how we met, to be honest, but he had kind of the same ambition that I did, as far as like he wanted to be a ski cinematographer, right? Like he wanted to film skiing, and he's a great skier, but he also was a really talented photographer and cinematographer. So same year, same time, we like cut our teeth learning how to snowmobile together. And there was a small group of us that went out a bunch. And I guess the rest is, yeah, available in PYP films.
So you have those two films, you put those down, but you're also one of those guys, like I said, you're not going to say, look at me, but you were like a word of mouth guy, almost like a myth, where people would talk about this dude doing huge 180s in POW, and people just didn't know who it was at first. Does Sweetgrass see the PYP videos and give you an invite to Valhalla from there?
I think Sweetgrass happened through Eliel Hindert. I think because he was filming with them, or had plans to film with them, and basically invited me out. And he was the one who actually ended up getting me kind of hooked up with Surface. And so I went out with a couple of the guys from the Surface team to Nelson, and we ended up crashing at the Sweetgrass house for like a month, I want to say, the one year. And I just, yeah, that was some of the best skiing I've ever had in my life, still to this day. You know, Nelson's a pretty special place, but that whole time when I was there, it was some of the best conditions I've been back year after year to try and replicate it, and haven't. Like, it was just amazing. So the stars really aligned on that one.
Nice. So yeah, you're on surface skis at this time, and it's like another one where someone hooks you up with surface. It's not like you go and get them. Fast forward a year or two, you've had a sled for a few years, and you're doing shit that not many other people are doing. When do you hear about the TGR 100K contest or the collab thing? And do you know right away that if you land the shit that you know you can, you have a real chance of winning $100,000 US?
Yeah. When they announced that, I can't remember our reaction, but it was sort of just like, yeah, right. Like there's no way.
Yeah.
Like everyone in the industry will enter this, like 100 grand, and anyone can go in. You're going to have everyone from the likes of Tom Wallish to Stage to just everyone. The whole spectrum of the industry is going to enter. And it wasn't necessarily front of mind when we were filming that winter. Like we had been going out filming. This maybe was like my third or fourth year with the snowmobile and just kind of doing our thing. And then we had like a pretty good chunk of footage at the end of the season. And we remembered like this contest was happening, and they had like some rules where like you couldn't release any of that footage prior to entering it and stuff. So we just held on to it, and we decided to go all in on the contest and see what happened.
With the edit, while you've landed Switch and POW countless times, the shit you do in the edit's pretty gigantic. Is there a fear level to that? Like when you're sitting on top of something getting ready to drop and you know that you're going to drop a 30-foot cliff and throw a late 180 and stomp the shit out of it, does that scare the shit out of you at all? Or is it like, you know, you've got it?
No, it's funny. I feel like I just stunned so many of them that like, depending on the exit, like it's not really any scarier than landing forwards. And for a lot of professional skiers, I feel like, a 30-foot cliff isn't something to write home about. It's like kind of a typical size that a lot of people are doing on a regular basis. So it just became one of these things where landing backwards was like second nature, and I didn't really think too much of it.
Well, it's funny because a lot of people have trouble, like, a lot of park guys will go into the POW and have trouble landing forward in POW just because they're like, holy shit, powder. Like I just interviewed Colby West and he was like, man, that was like way harder than I ever thought, and I really didn't do it as much. But for you, it's something that comes natural. But when you think about like mocking Switch, what's the worst Switch tomahawk you've ever had?
Oh, yeah, I've had some bad ones. I can't really think of one off the top of my head that specifically stands up. I'd say what's worse than the tomahawk is almost like the full crumple, like the knee to the face, like just sort of when you collapse into yourself. I've done that a couple times, and that rocks you even harder than kind of ragdolling. Because usually if you're tomahawking, like gravity's working with you a little bit in the fall, but when you fully compact into a hole, it just beats you up. I've had a couple broken noses. And I had one where I like bit a pretty big chunk of my top lip off. Like I kind of bit down and had to get it sewn back on, and punctured my tongue a couple times. And yeah, black eyes, stuff like that. Those are usually the worst. And they're honestly like usually from the dumbest stuff too. Like it's always never like the big stuff that gets you, right? It's always like kind of screwing around doing something stupid and small.
But I would think for this edit, the risk is worth the reward because 100K is a shit ton of money. And after you see all the edits, while I would think that you probably think you're going to win this thing based on everything else that you see, given there's some sick edits out there, there's like 43 of them, and there's 10 of them that are like really, really solid edits. Which other edits did you think could take it all along with yours?
Yeah, I mean, it was all rider voted, right? Like we had basically like it wasn't this kind of popularity contest thing. I think it might have been sort of Facebook likes or something at first to filter through, but then the finals was like rider voted, like the finalists all voted for the winner. And man, Dale Talkington's edit was like super, super sick. I remember watching, like as soon as that thing started up, it was just like, oh, we're in trouble now. Cause the 4x9 guys were really like at the top of their game. Like at that point, the cinematography too was just really like on the cutting edge. And I think like they had an incredible song, which the songs were tough kind of because they had to have all the rights and you had to get it from, kind of this site where you got to filter through a lot of garbage. If anyone's ever looked for music for an edit that you can use for free, it's pretty tough.
Yeah.
So they had done that super well. They had like the sick sound design, and then Dale was just skiing like at his highest level in his career, and it all kind of came together. And it was a totally different edit, right? It was like almost all urban. He actually had a bunch of like backcountry jumps in there too, like kind of springtime backcountry jumps, but it was like primarily street, and it was like super, super high level, high production value. And yeah, we knew that one was like definitely a contender. I remember watching Elise Sogsteds. It was just like, I think that was like the first time I'd ever heard of her as well. I think it really was like what gave her a ski career, or at least a recognizable name was that edit too.
And you
there was
too.
A few really sick edits. Yeah, there was some good edits in that. So we definitely felt some pressure.
What would you have done if you won 100K?
Well, we had planned on splitting it 50-50, and then you lose some to tax and stuff. So really it would basically have funded a winter, I'd say.
Okay.
At the end of the day, yeah, between the two of us, snowmobiling and trucks and all that stuff, when you're taking that much time off work to do it, it was adding up, right? And the support at that time was pretty low. If any, it was product and gear and stuff, right? So tough to make it work financially without like grinding pretty hard all off season.
And while you don't win, you kind of do win in some ways because this is when you get the invite to shoot with TGR. And with TGR, they're so good about helping people out with sponsors. And you're one of those guys that probably needs that nudge to meet all these people. Is it TGR that helps you meet Atomic and the North Face and line them up as sponsors so they can have you in the movie and get paid for them as well?
Yeah, with Atomic, like what happened was I got an email from the guy, Pat Folke. He ended up being kind of like my contact at TGR for this whole collab thing. And he was trying to get the finalists to come down. It was a pretty far drive to Jackson. And I was sort of like, my response basically was, how much do I need to come? Like, is it really that worth it for me to come before I commit to this drive? And he's like, you should come. Like, these guys really want to meet you. And so we made the trek and yeah, ended up meeting Todd Jones, and him and Steve were really fired up on the edit. They said that they just like, as soon as they heard the song and they saw kind of the soul behind it, it just spoke to them a little bit. They could just tell like there was something that they were excited about that was just different. And they introduced me to Jake Strasburger at Atomic. At the time, he was sort of going to a lot of these TGR premieres and he was really involved there. And basically they were like, look, we need to get you on Atomic. We need to get you aligned with us because we want to shoot you and like whatever it takes to make this happen. And I'd never really had like a sponsor that really paid, it was always just like free gear. And I was pretty particular about the skis I was riding, and the Ben Chatler was something I had never tried, but obviously it was reputable. And this was like right at the very beginning of the Horizon Tech, sort of the bevel tip and tail that they were just about to introduce. And it was all exciting. And so that was like a perfect time to join. And it all just kind of worked out where TGR already had a great relationship with them and they were looking for a new skier, and it just sort of right place, right time.
It's time for my final sponsor break, and I can't tell you how much I love my gear from Outdoor Research. When I signed on with OR, I knew there wasn't an outerwear brand on the market that performs as well as what OR is developing. That's what happens when you test your gear in the absolutely terrible conditions that we can get here in the Pacific Northwest. Days in the mountains are always more fun when you're warm and dry, and I know my OR gear will always deliver that. I'll tell you, on cold days, I live in my cold front hoodie, which is hands down the warmest and most stylish puffy I've ever owned. And then when I get on snow, my snow crew jacket and pants are not only warm, but it's one of those fits where if you don't see me ski, I look like a pro. I'm so impressed with the style that OR has been bringing to the table lately. And off snow, they sent me some Feroci pants, which are now my daily drivers. Think stylish, lightweight, packable, do-anything pants with the right amount of zippered pockets and stretch to be the only pant that you'll ever need. I love them. And really, I've been loving OR products since I bought my first OR rain jacket in 2000. And I'm going to save you 25% on your OR gear. Here's what you need to do. Head on over to outdoorresearch.com, go shopping, and when you check out, enter the code SNOW25 and you'll get the deal. That's all caps, no spaces, and the number 25. My final sponsor this round is Best Day Brewing. If you haven't heard of Best Day, they are hands down the best tasting non-alcoholic beer on the market. I enjoy Best Day for so many reasons. The flavor is the most important. I swear by the hazy IPA, the Kolsch, and the Belgian White. They all taste just as good or better than their alcoholic cousins. And I'll tell you, while I haven't quit drinking, when I go to the bar, after 3 or 4 beers, I usually feel like it's time for me to head home, and everyone thinks I'm lame. But lately, I have a new routine. I'll have a Best Day every 3rd beer, and it makes my night last twice as long. And we all know lasting longer is better. If you want to have your best day or night ever, or just enjoy a few cold ones at Après, grab a Best Day, and you can forget about the calories, forget about the alcohol, and forget about getting in trouble on the way home. To see all the flavors and order some beer, head on over to bestday.com. And if you're flying Alaska, you can now get a Best Day Kolsch at 30,000 feet. Those are my sponsors. Now let's get back into the podcast. Going into filming for Almost Ablaze, do you prepare for the season differently? Like, do you know that you have to prove yourself this season because you're going to ski with like all the big names?
I was just building on what I had already done, and I feel like I had good momentum. Like, that was right around the time when I was getting a bit more comfortable on my sled, and like exploring new places was getting easier and easier. I was wasting less energy. It's a lot of work when you're figuring out riding a snowmobile in deep snow. Like, it saps your energy, and just being able to like ski at a high level for yourself is pretty hard. Like, some days you just can't do it physically, and I was not wasting as much energy. I was getting the hang of filming a little bit more. And I ended up filming a lot of that first winter with Dylan Hood and Tim Durchie. And it was just an awesome crew. And we had like an awesome camera team. And I ended up driving down to Jackson for, I want to say about a month. And it was sort of my first time ever, with them filming. And I did well enough that they decided like, let's keep this going. We ended up going to Revelstoke, and I think we spent almost 2 months in Revelstoke. So I filmed for 3 months straight pretty much for that project. And the whole time it was with Dylan Hood and Tim Durchie. And then once we were up in Revelstoke, we had Dane Tudor join. And for sure it was like, I've been starstruck meeting these guys like at the premiere the year before and stuff. And then once you start skiing with them, it's just, you're very like-minded. We became friends really quickly, and, hanging out with those guys was awesome. And it was just more awesome skiers. I've been hanging out with a lot of pro skiers in Whistler and people who I'd looked up to that now I had befriended. And so it wasn't that unusual, but it was definitely exciting. And I just kind of kept going.
And when you wrap filming for that movie, do you have any idea what you've put together? Do you think that, hey, I could win some awards with the footage I put together? Or is it more like I had a solid season?
I felt like I had a solid season. I think everyone in this position always is kind of hoping they can do better than they have done. And there's always the ones that got away, like watching the crash reel that I have from that season. I think at that time was pretty frustrating because there's so many like almosts. But I remember like watching footage, we call it chimping, where we're like a bunch of monkeys standing around a screen and watching footage with Dylan Hood. And he's just like, man, you have a lot of shots this year, and this was like in January or something. And I didn't really think too much of it, but for sure that there was definitely like some stuff on the cutting room floor that was still pretty good for that segment. And it was definitely one of my prouder years.
Yeah, I mean, you earned Breakthrough Performer at the Powder Awards. I was the host that year. I think I got to introduce Ian McIntosh, who gave you your award. You were Rookie of the Year at IF3. And what does that kind of shit mean to you at that time? Like, is there a point where you're sitting there by yourself later on, contemplating everything that happened to you in the past year and a half or so, and just like feeling some emotion of winning these awards?
I remember being super glad that I had just decided to take that drive to Jackson Hole to go to that premiere and not been like too cheap to bother. Had I like said, no, thanks for the invite, but I'm not going to come, that's fine. It could have been a totally different story. I could have just still been building houses this whole entire time.
Whistler local getting free skis.
Yeah, it's funny how one small thing like that could change the course of your whole life or career, but it's really true. It's hard to put into words, but definitely like made the right decisions. And it was a lot of like right place, right time, stars aligning. The snow was great where I was that year, which doesn't happen all the time. So there was a lot of things kind of happening that definitely were in my favor.
And now that you're a known entity, or back then when you become a known entity, because everybody knows who you are in the ski world after you win those 2 awards, there's no way for them not to. When that kind of stuff happens, is that when you start getting invited to cool shit? Like, is that how you get to Red Bull Linecatcher? And what's that experience like?
Yeah, I think it would have been that next year, maybe, or 2 years later. I can't remember exactly which year that was. I went twice for Linecatcher, and that was like a dream come true. I'm not a contest skier, really. I never did many contests, but like that was, I thought was a really cool way to do a contest, because primarily it was like these film athletes that you don't see compete very much. And it was kickers built in like a backcountry venue. It was sort of, yeah, a contest for what we do live, So I thought that was super cool. And it was tough. I remember the first time going, and the venue was really, really thin snow conditions, and they were really worried about too many tracks kind of starting to expose too many rocks and stuff. And so they changed the format into like a 1-run format where they cut half the field. So I went all jet lagged, and the weather window, of course, came the day before the actual weather window was supposed to start for the contest. Like we flew there, and basically the next morning with jet lag had to just go compete. So I crashed on my one and only run. And then the second year, I remember going, and basically they came down for like the rider meeting when we all arrived, and they're like, oh yeah, so the venue slid to the ground today, so the comp's canceled. So it was like really cool to just be a part of that, and be there and be invited. But yeah, I felt like I never really actually got like much of a shot to compete, which is fine. I'm not a big contest guy, but would have been cool.
Does Red Bull fly you out there? I mean, is it something where for 2 years in a row, they're spending all this money to create this amazing event, and both years it kind of is like burning a budget?
Yeah, and I think that was the last year they had done it, because it was sort of it's a really hard thing to plan. Think about, like even just booking a ski vacation for yourself that far in advance is tricky with conditions. So hosting a big event like that's really difficult. And yeah, Red Bull does fly the athletes out and put them up and everything. So it's all kind of covered while you're there. So I'm sure it adds up, between closing a big parcel of terrain at a resort and paying all these guides and stuff to deal with it and build stuff. Yeah, it's a production.
You know, in thinking of your career after this, because I'm not going to talk about every year, because I feel like your career has become Groundhog Day, but with different style and different features every year. But when you think of TGR, it's like you're filming every year from 2014 or 15 on with them. Do you miss any years?
No, I think my first year was, 13, 14.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I've been in the film every year since then.
You know, when you think about it, you have so many different trips that you've done over the past decade, and it's so impossible to pick one trip that is just like the most all-time trip that you would love to do all over again. But if you can think about that, would it be that Nelson trip where you just got hammered with snow and it was perfect, or is something better in your career?
I mean, I think the best film trip I've ever had was I went to Alaska, and it would have actually been like Angel's last film trip. That was like when she ended up kind of having her second knee injury.
Okay.
Yeah, that trip, it was pretty unreal because it was just Elise and Angel and I for the first half, and Griffin Post ended up coming in for the second half, but he had an obligation. He couldn't make the first half. But Alaska can be fickle. I've been up there a couple times and been kind of skunked. Like we got out enough to make it a segment, but never felt like we really got it, just saw the potential and had to leave basically. But yeah, we got off the plane and there was just sort of 10 days of high pressure in a row and good stability. And it felt like there was no one else around.
Mm-hmm.
And, there was only 3 of us skiing. And it was just, I remember just like each day, like kind of building off of the previous day. And we were skiing all terrain that was really close to each other. So it just was like this perfect alignment of like feeling super comfortable, which is really hard to do up there. It's a pretty intimidating place. And when you actually get a chance to ski a bunch of days in a row in a bunch of terrain that's nearby what you skied yesterday and stuff, it felt like it was easy to build. And that was a pretty special trip for sure. There was 10 days in a row of high pressure. And I felt like ready for it to be cloudy or stormy or something. I just needed like a day off of the adrenaline because it was like every afternoon just was like bigger than the one before, which was pretty cool.
Another thing that you did with TGR that's totally different than what most athletes do is you narrate one of the movies. And I don't know how comfortable you are being recorded. I mean, you're doing fine now. But what's harder for you, the skiing or voicing over a whole movie?
Yeah, the VO was pretty tough. When they had that idea, I was pretty opposed originally. And then, they kind of had this bigger theme of like, well, we're going to kind of follow you throughout the winter. And we want to like sort of talk about you going, the movie was far out and they wanted to talk about me going like far out of my typical film zone of BC and around, the Pacific Northwest. And it was kind of like a heavy burden just knowing that everyone who's worked so hard on this film, all the other skiers and everything, like their whole season and all of their energy like relies sort of on the outcome of this VO.
Right.
So it was quite a bit of pressure because like if I botched it or if it came out poorly, like everyone else's segments in the film are not going to be as good as they could have been and whatever, right? So I had that sort of in the back of mind, but at the end of the day, like those guys are always really accommodating and easy to work with. And, the production staff over there have been awesome over the years. So they made it as easy as they could for me. And Todd Jones, I think, was kind of guiding me along. He just would text me once in a while, like, just stay in the pocket. You've got this, just trust the process. It's going to be sick, and then I would get have to do like another recording because they tweak something or whatever. And, I think it turned out okay. It's definitely a harder one for me to watch because I don't really love listening to myself talk. I don't think that many people do, but yeah, I guess it worked out all right.
Yeah. And, with this podcast, and I'm sure you've heard different episodes, so you know that I'm a big fan about asking about money. And while ski movies don't pay athletes, they will pay like $20,000 or more to use a song, which is crazy, but that's what they cost. So that's what it is. But is there some extra green in it for you for narrating the movie, or is it more just part of your whole deal?
No extra green for me. But, at the end of the day, it's more exposure for me and more screen time, more sort of like I'm involved at a higher level, which only looks good for future relations with everyone. And, it's working for free for myself in a way.
It's building your brand, and a lot more people are going to know you because you're the speaker in that movie. And you know what? There's not too many other athletes that have narrated a TGR movie, so you're one of the dudes that has. But how about money overall? You've been a paid pro for about a decade. Who are the brands that pay you?
So the North Face and Atomic, they're my biggest ones. GoPro, I've been on their team now for a year. Yeah, I think that's it right now.
So those are 3 huge sponsors, and you're a professional athlete. Are you able to make 6 figures a year and then get a good travel budget on top of that?
Yeah, it's about that, I think, with everything all added up. Essentially, the way I see it right now, it's like no one's getting rich in this industry, but I'm making enough that like I don't have to be a contractor. And if I was a contractor full time all year, I would probably be making, roughly equivalent. So it feels like at this stage of my life that it's like a reasonable income for what I do.
Do you own a house, truck, sled, and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, we have all the things you need.
Okay. Do you have any other toys, or are you more of a saver?
I mean, I have a mountain bike and a lot of climbing equipment. I spend a lot of time rock climbing, so it's like a lot of small little widgets and stuff. But I'm not big on like, I don't have like jet skis and side by sides and stuff. I have just the essentials: snowmobile, truck, mountain bike. You need to have one around here, and that's pretty much it.
Okay. Back to TGR. You know that I have to bring this up in the podcast, and I'm sure you're ready for it. So first, when you're shooting for Tight Loose, you're at North Cascade Heli, and everything rips out. And it was just like you were a fucking cat getting out of that one. Take us through that.
The thing with ski films is they can be often quite dramatic compared to how it felt in real life. But I remember that being just sort of like any other little storm day on the ski hill where like you ski cut something and it actually slides a little bit and you end up having a straight line and air something small. Am I thinking of the same thing?
I don't think so.
Maybe I'm thinking of something else. Oh, my first trip to Alaska might have been in that film, wasn't it? Yeah, that was a big eye opener for sure. That was like the classic, never been to Alaska. A small little thing turns pretty big up there pretty fast. And yeah, I remember skiing over like a little bit of wind affected snow and it cracks. And I think, it's a pretty big propagation, but it's maybe only 6 inches deep or so. Like it's not a massive deep layer. It's just a fair bit of terrain that goes all at once. And I remember getting flushed. Yeah, I got flushed and kind of slammed into a bit of a side hill, like wind lip or something. And my skis are still there actually, but that rattled me. And it ended up being one of the only days that we got out. I think we got out maybe 2 to 3 days, that whole like 3-week trip. And it was the first run of the day. And so I had to sit out the rest of that session for that. So that was like extra punishment to just sit there and think about it. But that was a big eye opener. It's like first time to Alaska. I might have been around 26 or something and still had a bit to learn about the big mountains at that point.
And that's not even the one I was talking about, because the one I was talking about was at North Cascade Heli, because I think I Googled North Cascade Heli and your name, and I saw the video, and you don't get flushed at all. It's like everything rips out,
yeah.
And you're going lookers right, and you just kind of air over everything and kind of just, you make an escape. It was a close call, but you were able to outrun.
Yeah, that was the first one I was talking about. From my perspective, that one was like pretty trivial. Like the whole thing that was happening on the cameras, like looks like super dramatic, was kind of mellow from my perspective where I was. And I feel like I have moments like that just sort of skiing around on the hill, or I see it happen all the time where like, you're just cutting across something and like maybe it slides a little bit in front of you. You just have like a redirect mandatory little point out of something small. Like it didn't really feel nearly as crazy as the shot ended up looking.
Okay. Well, 3 years later, you're on top of a pillow line. You have Ian McIntosh, Sam Smoothie, and Christina Lustenberger watching you from down low. You crush your first line. You go up for a second lap. The crew's watching. You drop. You crush your pillow line again. And when you're airing into this gully, you collide with like a bus-sized pillow that had broken off. What do you remember from your line and from that impact?
Yeah, this is still just such a weird freak thing for me because like the way that it happened, like it seemed like so just random. I think the danger rating was like 2 or whatever, and like the stability that we had seen was great. But what happened was like a little tiny bit of slough landed on this kind of hairpin trigger, massive pillow that just was sort of clinging onto a cliff, right? And it didn't take much. Basically, the wrong wind would have blown it off, and it just started, trundling down. And unfortunately, my line ended up kind of crossing paths with it right in front of some trees, and T-boned me, raked me through kind of some mature timber. And I was lucky that I got my arm up as quickly as I did, but shattered my arm, shoved me face down in the snow. And I just remember sort of lying there thinking like, okay, you're helpless, but fortunately you've got like a huge crew right over there, so they're going to be here any second.
Well, I was in a car accident in November, and I'm fine, but while it was happening, everything slowed down. And from the footage of this, everything seems to happen so fast. Like when you're going through those trees, it's like it looks like you're just ping-ponging, but you can't see you, just see the trees snapping back. Do you get that slow motion effect at all? Or does it just happen so fast?
No, I definitely know that slow motion feeling you're talking about. And this one was so instant. I feel like I got my arm up and I got like plowed face first in the snow, and then I was just in the snow. It happened really, really quick, like no time to react really.
When you're buried, you're like 1.5 meters down. Are you conscious, and does the shock help you not feel the pain?
Yeah, conscious, and I think shock, but also just sort of like prioritizing, like I don't have oxygen, like I think pain becomes secondary to not being able to breathe.
Did you have a pocket in front of you?
No, not really. And I just remember, if I tried to breathe, I couldn't. But, snow is like at some level porous, even when it's avalanche debris. And so I was able to sort of just inhale as slow as you possibly can imagine. And I could pull a little bit of air. And then I just had to kind of like zen out and try and control my breathing and just fight as little as possible and just sort of relax as much as I could. But by the time those guys hit me with a probe, I was definitely like fading. I kind of felt myself like getting more comfortable and almost like, oh, I'm just going to have a nap, like dying, basically.
Was there fear? Because you hear about people's lives, like everything flashing right in front of them. Do you have any of that?
It's surreal to think back, but yeah, it was almost like a weird, peaceful, originally the first like instant is like, yeah, fear, panic. Oh no, I can't move. I'm stuck. I can't breathe. But then like by the time they actually got to me, I think because I had just like been convincing myself that I needed to calm down. And I also knew that they're all right there. Like we train for this. This is why we have transceivers. This is the whole reason why we practice. Like I had that all in my mind. Like they're going to be on top of me any second now. So that kind of kept me going and kept me sort of calm. That was my thought process there. But yeah, fear wasn't weirdly absent. It was kind of like getting comfortable, which is a scary place to be.
Yeah, I can imagine. And you're with some of the most experienced skiers on the planet. I mean, Lusty's an ACMG certified guide at that point, and you've got the best there. So is there a confidence like these guys are going to get me and you're not as worried as you would be if it was just some other skiers?
Yeah, definitely. Had it just been like some random people I met on the chairlift and it happened like in a weird place, or had it been like skiing some bigger pillow line where I got hung up like way up on the face and they had this maybe tour up to me or something. But I knew that I was like right at the bottom of the line. They were all sitting on their sleds, just right there. It was best case scenario for that type of thing to happen, to be buried like that and injured, like to have 6 other people all within a 30-second snowmobile ride on flat ground to me was ideal. Like in my mind, there was no reason that they shouldn't be getting me out of here in a couple minutes at the most,
And it's go time for them, and they get right into go mode. They get there in like 2 minutes. Can you hear them romping around?
No, man. Yeah, 1.5 meters down. It's a pretty dark place. There's not much going on down there. Can't hear.
So they're on their way, and you have your beacon, so they're going to be able to find you. What you don't know is that when they switch their beacons on to search, they get no signal. And while there's no full panic going on with them, you can hear the uncertainty in their voices in the video. And every time I watch it, I get the chills. When you see that footage, what does that do to you?
Yeah, I mean, I can't watch it anymore, honestly. I saw it, a few times, and it's just, yeah, I don't watch it, but it gives me the chills too. And I feel like in a way, what they went through is almost harder, at least like, that first little while, because they straight up think that our friend's dead. Like we should be able to save him when we can't. We have all these tools and they're useless. Like that's what crosses their mind. And that amount of panic, like I can't imagine being on the other side of the coin. Cause to me, I'm just sort of ignorant down there, right? I'm like in the snow, just like waiting for their probe strike. Like they got me for sure. This is why we practiced. For them, it's a different world. The whole thing is in their hands. It's out of my hands. And so they're panicking, and that's tough, man.
It's all in their hands. And the one tool they have that should pinpoint you easily is not on, so they can't find you. And it really is like, I don't know if there's a God out there or what goes on, but the drone pilot probes the last place he thinks he saw you go, and he gets a strike on like his first probe. Can you describe how lucky that was?
Yeah, like second or third probe or something. Yeah, it was like so fast. He was the last one to get there just because he was further away and yeah, with the drone and everything. But yeah, I just remember getting hit with that thing. And at that point where I was, like I said, kind of getting comfortable and almost falling asleep or whatever, that re-alerted me and that like kind of re-engaged the whole panic. It like snaps you back into reality, right? Like getting hit with that stick, you're like, oh, I'm going to make it. And then suddenly you're like, oh, I can't breathe again. So that whole minute or two was like really, really panicky for me. But yes, I think like him being able to tell where I was, because the whole area generally wasn't that huge. But when you have a giant pile of snow that's like 30 feet wide by 60 feet long, it's big enough that finding a person in there before they dies with no transceiver is like daunting.
I mean, how much time do you have? In theory, from all your training, what do they tell you in terms of the minutes that you have?
Obviously, the faster, the better. But like your odds after half an hour are so slim of living, like if you can make it past half an hour, you're an anomaly at that point. And for them to like do a strategic probe line, like full reset, everyone hike up the hill and like comb the terrain and then dig me out. Like there's no way that would have been less than say 15 minutes or something, for them to properly do it. And at that point, like I was going to be unconscious probably shortly already. So I would have been out for probably 10 minutes or something by then. So yeah, it was looking pretty grim if they didn't get to me pretty soon. And fortunately, yeah, Ben Dan, cinematographer, saved my life. All those guys did, but he found me with the probe, and he just knew exactly where to look. I guess being up in the air like that.
You're injured and you're freezing, and they get you out. And how long do you have to wait until search and rescue can get you to a hospital?
2 hours ish, maybe roughly. It was like perfect conditions too. It was midday. It happened around 1 or 2 in the afternoon, I think. We were on this there's a flat lake for the heli to land on, which is like awesome because normally when something like this might happen, it'd be like choked with tight trees and super steep technical terrain. They could just land and shut down right next to us, and there was no wind. Like there was a bunch of reasons why it was ideal conditions for everything, as far as like an accident response goes. But it still did take a couple hours, and once I was in the heli, it was only like a 5-minute flight down to the valley.
What's the injury list?
The main one was my arm was shattered, so I broke both the bones in my forearm. I collided with like a mature, maybe 6 or 8 inch diameter tree and kind of got shoved through it by getting my arm up in front of me. So my arm was just mangled. My wrist was a few inches recoiled towards my elbow back from where it should be, and my arm was just like rubberized. And then because I had got my arm up and I ended up kind of punching myself in the chest, I had like some internal trauma. I had a little bit of bleeding in my lungs, and I had a bruised heart.
What does a bruised heart feel like?
The arm was definitely like the distracting injury. It just felt like, I don't know, broken ribs kind of maybe.
Okay.
Basically like the whole chest injury thing was like so trivial compared to how badly my arm was broken, at least from like a pain perspective. I think at the hospital, they were pretty concerned about the chest stuff because I was in there for 4 nights, I think. And part of that was they were a bit worried about compartment syndrome. Like the swelling in my arm was really, really bad. But just to monitor like the heartbeat, like there was sort of an irregular heartbeat for a few days, I think.
Okay. And eventually, does the crew come to you with questions like, why was your beacon off? Or did you guys figure out that it was an equipment malfunction? How did that whole thing play itself out?
Yeah, I mean, we figured it out right away. Those guys basically, I think I was pretty drugged up at the hospital, but I believe they, took my transceiver and played with it. And they're like, yeah, this thing works fine. Why would it have not been on? Because we did for sure check in the morning, and it's like very, very standard protocol for us. Like it's part of being in the industry, like you go in the backcountry, you turn on your transceivers and everyone does a transceiver check and you make sure they're working. So we started to figure out like, okay, well, something's up with this. And Christina, being a guide, has access to this thing called the InfoX, but they basically where guides it's like forums for guides where they can talk. And there had been like reports of this transceiver failing others in the past. And yeah, there had been a fatality, at least one, if not more, linked to this device failing. And we were able to replicate it. And basically, like, as we started discussions with the people over at Peeps and Black Diamond, who owns Peeps, it kind of opened this big can of worms.
Well, I mean, it's like you guys tell them, hey, you guys have a ticking time bomb on your hands and you guys need to do something about it before someone else dies. What's their reaction right away?
So the timing of this is all really funky, too, because I got hurt at the beginning of March in 2020. So if you think about what happened in March and April 2020, the world completely shuts down. People stop going into work. There's a lot of unknowns. So, there's that sort of asterisk on the whole thing timeline wise, but they basically like within a reasonable amount of time get back to us, and this transceiver gets mailed down and somehow makes it to Salt Lake and is apparently lost. The tracking number says it's like lost or something. But they start doing these tests and they start talking to us and engaging, and they seem genuinely concerned. It kind of gets deposited onto like, I guess the sort of technical side of things. Like it goes like to the engineers who like run the tests on these things.
Yeah.
They start like collecting all of these like X warranty transceivers and running them through their testing and stuff. And they basically come to the conclusion over X amount of time that like, hey, this thing passes all of the tests. It meets the guidelines, and we can like give a soft warning to people, but like we can't do a recall on this thing because it meets all the guidelines. The way that it works, there's this governing body, the ETSA, they do like this standardized you have to pass all these tests, right? And there's all this document has all this stuff with like UV resistance and waterproof levels and just all the different, ranges and battery life and stuff. So it's a huge document. But as far as like the actual mechanism that turns it on and off, it's, a couple sentences. And it basically says that it has to have an on-off switch that's easy for the user to see and use and is obvious that it's on or off and whatever. So it's up to every brand and every engineer and designer to figure out putting a button on this thing to turn it on and off. And when we told them that their button was flawed and it seemed like the case that you wear it in actually like makes it worse and blah, 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 that's when, basically 6 months or so had lapsed and we were telling them like, look, you have until the fall until this film comes out to do something and get ahead of this. And that's when things went south in the conversation and basically, maybe legal told them to stop communicating with us or whatever. But yeah, then they kind of go quiet. And shortly after that, I think the following spring, they issue some kind of like 3D printed case thing that holds it.
Yeah, they created a Band-Aid for it, but really it's your job and your friend's job at that point to let all your other friends know, do not buy this beacon. It is dangerous, right? Do you let everyone you can possibly know that in the fall when people are out buying their gear? Because it's COVID time and everybody wants to get in the backcountry because that's like the only place you can do anything, it seems like, and you have to let people know what's dangerous.
Yeah, for sure. We felt like a huge sense of responsibility because like, again, like everything that happened that day, it was almost like the perfect conditions for something like that to happen. For it to happen to a professional skier in a film setting in perfect weather with a ton of experienced people there, basically we had this thing fail in perfect conditions to be able to still save my life. And there's a ton of other people out there who don't have that same scenario. They're just skiing with a few friends, maybe less experienced. There's not a bunch of people just watching you with cameras while you're doing it right on top of you. Like an avalanche happens to the last person in the group and they're way up the hill or whatever. There's so many other ways that like it would be more dangerous for just the general public to have this thing fail on them. And the widower of the person who died actually near Whistler wearing this device, that it was sort of like pretty quiet news, which is why I didn't know about it at the time. But she reached out and she said she tried to talk to them and they basically told her the same stuff, like, yeah, it passes the test, like, sorry, kind of thing.
Huh.
She reached out and basically was saying like, it would be great if you guys are able to help spread this word. Cause I tried, but she's just, just an average citizen who doesn't have like a big online presence in the industry and all these industry contacts. And we just decided like, we have to use this sort of online presence to be able to spread this message and tell people. Cause if something were to happen and we didn't try our hardest to get the word out and we found out about it later, like how guilty would we feel, like, of course it's the right thing to do. It's a small industry and you don't want to like kind of rub companies the wrong way and get a bad reputation, but standing up for what's right, like backcountry safety equipment functioning correctly is a really important thing. It's the whole transceiver system that we rely on in general. Like the last thing you think about is the transceiver not doing its job, and to just go talk to people on Instagram just seemed like, of course, we have to at least do that and do some interviews and field questions from news media and stuff. And it ended up blowing up pretty big and it's still kind of ongoing as is happening right now. But also like I'm being reached out to, I'd say once or twice a month from random news sources and stuff. It's still ongoing lawsuits and it's a big mess still.
Oh, I didn't know that it's still going on. Do you ever receive an apology or would that be them accepting guilt?
Nothing official, that's for sure.
Well, that whole thing is so scary, and I'm happy that you lived to tell the tale. And really, that's our podcast. We could talk about a lot of other things, but we're not going to. And that's not all I have for you either, because now, if you've listened to the podcast, which you told me you did, you know that it's time for Inappropriate Questions. And I was going to get a good friend and longtime TGR filmer, Scotty Titterington, Scotty Tits, I guess I'll call him, to ask the questions. So it would have been tits to nuts, but Scotty was busy, and he put me in touch with another longtime friend of yours, Tony Kelly. And the only thing I know about Tony is that he learned doubles before you did, and he thinks that me saying that on the podcast would really annoy you. Are you ready for question number 1 from Tony?
I'm ready.
Question 1. Would you rather have sex with a goat and nobody knows, or not have sex with a goat but everybody thinks that you did?
I was going to ask for a different question because I don't usually do those would you rathers, but I've never even heard one about having sex with a goat and then having the second part being like, would you not have sex with a goat? So I don't know. I'm going to let this one fly. And what's your thoughts on sex with goats?
It's funny you got Tony to do these questions, man. The second two will probably be entertaining as well, but I'm going to go with not having sex with the goat and whatever you can try and convince people, I guess, if they believe that you did. But yeah, I don't know. That's having sex with the goats. Pretty fucked up, man.
Do you like goats?
I mean, as animals, they're kind of cool. Not in that way, though.
All right, fair enough. Either do I. I don't like them like that either. Maybe Tony does, but we'll go into question number 2.
The second question that I have for you, Nick, is from the couple stags that we've been together. I don't want to get into the last one too much because it is a little bit embarrassing for me. But maybe you could pick a good story about one of us, myself or Phil, a funny story from one of our last stags that we went on.
So I think with that, we should just go with what's the dumbest shit that Tony's ever done at one of these stags? Because he, just based on the questions he's asking, I'm going to guess that he's one of the loose cannons of your crew.
Tony's the loosest cannon of our crew, man. I grew up with him skiing in Kimberley when we were kids, and he moved out to Whistler, and I think he ended up having like some pretty chronic pain in his knee and his ankle and stuff just from like sending it too hard, but actually his brother, for a side note, is Vince Keller, who's Sammy Carlson's roommate and a sick skier. I don't know if you've ever followed Vince Keller, but anyways, that was a total side note. Yeah. So what's the craziest thing Tony has done? I don't think I can really say. I remember when we went to Vegas, first bachelor party I went to for one of our close friends, and we went to Vegas. What happens in Vegas stays down there. But something I can tell from that trip was that Tony was pretty absent from just hanging out with us in general the whole time. And he pretty much wore like a karate, I can't remember what it's called, but the karate suit thing.
Yeah.
That's like, yeah, he wore that around Vegas with nothing underneath it. He was just cruising Vegas solo. He kind of lost us, and he had tons of fun. He was stoked, but we didn't see a whole lot of him. And sure enough, he made it onto the flight somehow at the end of the whole thing. But yeah, he was just wearing that karate suit for a couple days by himself in Vegas.
Is he one of those guys that when he shows up back at the hotel room or on the flight, he's got the karate suit on and a whole bunch of glitter all over his body too?
Oh yeah, and missing half of his stuff, and maybe like, where's my passport, and been robbed already somewhere. And yeah, he runs a pretty loose program. He still makes it to some stuff once in a while, but sometimes you invite him and he says he's going to be there, and something just tackles him along the way.
All right, so we're going to go with his final inappropriate question. I think this one we're going to learn a little bit more about him, but here we go.
For the third question, Nick, I am most likely going to be moving back to Squamish in the springtime, and I'm wondering if you and Kelly would be able to help me out with getting a girlfriend, going on a double date, maybe out of the golf course or anything nice. And if you have anybody in mind, what would you tell them about me?
Tony's got a few great things going for him, man. He's a good-looking guy. He's strong. He works hard. He might party a little too hard too, but that can change. We're growing up, so yeah, I think we could definitely help you out with that. We can go for a double date, go golfing. You can show him how well you hit the ball. You can tell him some wild stories, maybe not the wildest ones, but yeah, I would tell him you're a good old farm boy. He grew up Swiss. Yeah, he's got a lot of good things going for him, but he's just got to reel it in a little bit with maybe some of the looser stories.
We talked for about 20 minutes just talking about you and life and times. And he told me, I think 2 different times during that call that he was totally serious about that third inappropriate question. Like, I'm really going there and I really need a date. So make sure he knows that was serious. So I do want you to know that was serious.
Well, that's awesome, man. We don't see enough of him, and it'd be good to have him around because, yeah, he's missed. We got a good group of friends, and he's one of them, but he's been working away from, doing remote kind of camp type work for the last bunch of years. So it'd be good to see more of him.
All right. Well, I'm happy that he was able to do the inappropriate questions. He was a fun guy to talk to. And that's our podcast. And the path that you took to pro skiing was pretty interesting because you're not one that marketed yourself. You didn't sell yourself. And it all started happening because people were talking about the shit that you were doing. And then you and Scotty find out about the collab contest. You enter it. And while you don't win, you do win. Scotty gets a job and TGR finds you and finds you big sponsors, which makes it easier for you to have a long pro career. And yeah, maybe things could have been a little bit faster if you were a self-promoter, but who gives a fuck, man? You continue to live the dream, and I thank you for telling your story, and I thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Mike, and I'm looking forward to listening to future episodes. You've been doing a great job.
So that was time with Nick McNutt. And his story is one that defines the idea that if you do what you love, good things will happen. I mean, Nick wasn't trying to be a pro skier, it just kind of happened for him. And while he's been absolutely crushing it over the past decade, he's also experienced what the worst part about being a pro skier is. While he didn't die or paralyze himself, he knows what it's like to be buried and helpless. Luckily, he was with the right people, and that combined with a probe strike of luck saved his life. Scary shit, and it sucks when a brand doesn't take accountability for a product that could be lethal. To the brand and the people, you know who you are, and you need to do better. Nick's still here, but others aren't, and that must make it tough to sleep at night. Enough about that though, it's time for the review of the week. This one is a 5-star review titled Must Listen, and it's from Anderski13. Here's the review. First off, Mike is the absolute man, keeping composure in all interviews and asking the questions that all skiers want to know while remaining kind and humorous. Guest list is second to none, and the podcasts never get repetitive as each guest brings a fresh perspective that Mike manages to pull out. And just a note to Mike, we're all thinking about you and your family in this tough time, and it's so admirable that you continue to spread stroke throughout it all. Well, Anderski13, thank you very much for that review. I really pride myself in having an all-time guest list. I feel like if you look at any podcast out there, you look at their guest list, you look at mine, mine's going to be better. And it's not a competition, but I'm always looking for those people that make the show diverse and also have stories that you're not going to get everywhere else. Sure, a lot of us overlap, and I'm going to overlap with other people as well in terms of guests, but that shit happens, and really, it's my job to differentiate my podcast from other podcasts by asking questions that other people won't ask. And while I'm not listening to everyone else's interviews, I know that my questions are going to be a little bit different because my personality and interview style is just a lot different than everyone else out there, in my opinion. It sounds like you have the same opinion, so thank you for that. From here, email me at mike@thepowellmovement.com and I will send you something Powell Movement branded that is awesome. I thank you for doing it. For everybody else who wants to review the podcast, please do so. It helps me with the algorithm. It also makes me feel good about myself, but really, you don't care about that. I don't need to feel great about myself. And while I'm saying this, and I totally forgot, thank you, Anders, for also thinking about me and my family, because yeah, it is a challenge to get this thing done every week, but you know what? I'm a planner. I'm always ahead of the game, and we're in a good spot for getting through this year. So thank you for that. And now I'll let you know how you can review the podcast if you want to do it. First, hit the podcast icon on your iPhone. Second, search for the Powell Movement. And even if you already subscribe to this podcast, you still need to search for the Powell Movement. Third, click my logo. Fourth, scroll down to where you see the stars. Fifth, star rate me and review the podcast. You can just star rate me and be done, and that'll take about 10 seconds. But if you review me, it might take 30 seconds to a minute, and you have a chance to win something from me. It's greatly appreciated. I thank you so much for doing it. I also thank you for supporting the brands that make this podcast happen. They are Elon Skis, Outdoor Research, Stanley, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, and Best Day Brewing. Have a great week, everyone.